Okay, here we are again. We're going to get going with First Samuel. But first, because I must have had a senior moment yesterday, I forgot to do First Samuel 11. So it's not a long chapter. We're going to read it now. And this is going to be before Samuel gave his admonition to Israel about how he'd never, we'll look at it. Okay, so let's just read this. This is after Saul went home with the valiant men, and there were a few men that did not honor him, and he made note of them, but he didn't say anything. Do you remember that? Okay, so this is the chapter after that, okay? So here we go. Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead, and all the men of Jabesh said to him, "Make a treaty with us, and we'll be subject to you." But Nahash the Ammonite replied, "I'll make a treaty with you only on the condition that I gouge out the right eye of every one of you and so bring disgrace on all Israel." Boy, some people are really ugly vengeful, aren't they? The elders of Jabesh said to him, "Give us 7 days so we can send messengers throughout Israel. If no one comes to rescue us, we will surrender to you." When the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and reported these terms to the people, they all wept aloud. Just then, Saul, the newly crowned king, was returning from the fields behind his oxen, and he asked, "What's wrong with everyone? Why are they weeping?" Then they repeated to him what the men of Jabesh had said. When Saul heard their words, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he burned with anger. He took a pair of oxen, cut them into pieces, and sent the pieces by messengers throughout Israel, proclaiming, "This is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel." Then the terror of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out together as one. When Saul mustered them at Bezek, the men of Israel numbered 300,000, and those of Judah 30,000. They told the messengers who had come, "Say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, by the time the sun is hot tomorrow, you will be rescued." When the messengers went and reported this to the men of Jabesh, they were elated. So the time of the sun being hot would probably be about 3 in the afternoon. So Saul is sending messengers to them saying, "Don't worry, we'll rescue you by the time the sun is burning hot tomorrow." So they were elated by this message. They said to the Ammonites, "Tomorrow we'll surrender to you, and you can do to us whatever you like." See, they know they're going to get rescued, so they're just appeasing them for now. The next day, Saul separated his men into 3 divisions during the last watch of the night. They broke into the camp of the Ammonites and slaughtered them until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered so that no 2 of them were left together. The people then said to Samuel, "Who was it that asked, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Turn these men over to us so that we may put them to death." So they're saying this is a great victory. Anybody who doubted Saul must be put to death, okay? But Saul said, "No one will be put to death today, for this day the Lord has rescued Israel." Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal and there renew the kingship." So all the people went to Gilgal and made Saul king in the presence of the Lord. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord, and Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration. Now it says here in the footnotes, in the Masoretic text, I don't know what Masoretic is, but it says Dead Sea Scrolls gifts. And it says, "Now Nahash, king of the Ammonites, oppressed the Gadites and Reubenites severely. He gouged out all their right eyes and struck terror and dread in Israel. Not a man remained among the Israelites beyond the Jordan whose right eye was not gouged out by Nahash, king of the Ammonites, except that 7,000 men fled from the Ammonites and entered Jabesh Gilead." Okay, so, and then it says about a month later. So basically what it's saying is that Nahash had already gone into another area where the Gadites and Reubenites were and was gouging out eyes. Then he arrived at Jabesh Gilead, and said, this is what I'm going to do to you too. And they're like, wait, hold up. We'll surrender to you, but just give us a minute. And the whole thing reached Saul's ears, and Saul slaughtered them, okay? So they were so excited that Saul did this. They were saying anybody who doubted Saul needs to be put to death. And he's like, no, that's not going to happen today, okay? So now the next thing that we heard was in 1 Samuel 12, Samuel was old, and his sons weren't following the Lord, but he was saying, look, I'm old now. Let's go there just for a second and refresh our memory, okay? 1 Samuel 12. And this was what we did last night. This was the first chapter we read. Samuel said to all Israel, I've listened to everything you said to me and have set a king over you. Okay, so we just left chapter 11 where they had another coronation of Saul in front of the Lord and had all the sacrifices. Now you have a king as your leader. As for me, I'm old and gray, and my sons are here with you. I've been your leader from my youth until this day. Here I stand. Testify against me in the presence of the Lord and his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey? And they said, you've done well by us. Okay? And then it goes on, and we see Saul losing his grip and not doing what the Lord told him to do with the Amalekites. And when I say losing his grip, I don't mean over the kingdom, I mean his integrity. Okay? The Lord said, wipe out those Amalekites because they were especially offensive to the Lord for what they did in mocking the circumcision. Okay, now let's remember what circumcision means. Circumcision is a picture of a heart being open to God. Okay, so when the Amalekites came and started maiming the young boys and the old men who couldn't run fast enough or fight back or were too weak to fight, that was a gross injustice. The Lord made note of it and promised he was going to wipe them out. So he set Saul to do that, and Saul didn't. What Saul did was he wiped out what he wanted to wipe out and plundered the rest. And Samuel, the prophet, came to Saul and said, you know what? You blew it. And Saul said, I'm sorry. And he said, it doesn't matter. The Lord doesn't want your burnt offerings and all these things that you think you're doing that are right. He wants your obedience, and you didn't do it. So as Samuel was leaving, Saul grabbed the hem of his robe. I think he was probably in tears saying, whatever, don't let this happen to me. And Saul said, just the way you've torn my robe, that's how Israel is going to be torn out of your hands, because God's already chosen someone better than you to be the next king. And that's a reference to little shepherd boy David, okay, which we're going to hear about now, all right? So let's go to 1 Samuel 16, since we ended with 15 last night, and we're going to pick it up here. The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, since I've rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. Jesse is David's father. I've chosen one of his sons to be king, but Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul hears about it, he'll kill me. The Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice and I'll show you what to do. You're to anoint for me the one I indicate. Because Jesse has, I think, 7 or 8 sons. Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, do you come in peace? Samuel replied, yes, in peace. I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me. Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab, one of Jesse's sons, and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, don't consider his appearance or his height, for I've rejected him. The Lord doesn't look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Jesse then had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, nor has the Lord chosen this one. Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord hasn't chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? There is still the youngest, Jesse answered. He's tending the sheep. Samuel said, "Send him. We'll not sit down until he arrives." So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. I was told, and I don't know how anybody knew this, but it's said that David was a redhead and that he wasn't tall. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah. Now, the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. Saul's attendants said to him, "See, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you." Excuse me, allergies. "Let our Lord command his servant here to search for someone who can play the lyre, L-Y-R-E. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes on you, and you'll feel better." So Saul said to his attendants, "Find someone who plays well and bring him to me." One of the servants answered, "I've seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. He's a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well, and he's a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him." Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David who's with the sheep." Now, remember, Saul doesn't know that David's been anointed to be the new king, okay? Saul knows nothing. So Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them with his son David to Saul. David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse saying, "Allow David to remain in my service, for I'm pleased with him." Whenever the Spirit from God came on Saul, David would take up his lyre and play. Then relief would come to Saul. He would feel better and the evil spirit would leave him. Excuse me. You know, as I'm thinking about this, I'm almost wondering if the evil spirit that is tormenting Saul is tormenting him with some kind of depression or mental illness, because it says, then relief would come to Saul, he would feel better. Now, how many of us that suffer with depression use music to combat it? Okay, oftentimes. Now, I haven't gone through an episode, knock on wood, for a long time with depression, but when I have been depressed, a lot of times I'll put in the headphones and I'll listen to something I really like Typo Negative. I just love that band, okay? And for those of you who don't know, it's a very gothic, dark, not dark as in content, but a really melodic, dark, melodious rock. And I really love it. And the singer was like a deep, deep baritone. And I'll put that on, and also it's very hard rock. And I like all kinds of music, but I prefer hard rock, metal. I love that. To me, it exemplifies the passion that I feel in my heart. Okay, so I put that on, and within 2 minutes, my depression has lifted. So it almost sounds here like Saul is perhaps going into depression. Now, for those of you who don't know what depression is, it's not a bad mood. It's not a sad feeling. It's physical. It's like having a rock land on your head and push you down. It's definitely very physical. So he could have not been able to get out of depression, and the music that David played lifted his spirits and I don't want to say lifted his spirits because it's not a sadness, okay, but did something to change the chemistry, bring the serotonin back. And of course, this is all conjecture, and relieve him of the depression, okay? Now, the other thing I want to say regarding that is I am not in any way saying that depression is always demonic. Okay, I don't believe that for a minute, because brains have chemicals. It's organic. If you're missing a chemical, you will feel depression, okay? So please do not take it that I am saying that depression is demonic or mental illness is demonic. There may be episodes of mental illness that are demonic. Perhaps a spirit that has been sent from the enemy, not from the Lord, that is tormenting a person. It's possible. But that's not the first thing I would think in this day and age. I would think, that there's a chemical imbalance, yada, yada, yada. Okay, you get my point. I don't want to belabor it. All right, so we're going to read that again. Whenever the Spirit from God came on Saul, because God's not with Saul anymore, so David would pick up his lyre and play. Now, a lyre was like a guitar, but it was more shaped like a harp, okay? It didn't have the long neck of a guitar, but it kind of had the body of one, and it had strings. Then relief would come to Saul. He would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him. Okay, so take what I'm saying, and if you don't agree, just leave it. Okay, it doesn't matter. You don't have to agree with me. It's just my own conjecture. Okay, take what you need, leave the rest. All right, 1 Samuel 17. Now, the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soko in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim between Soko and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. Now, that's interesting because there's a movie called The Valley of Elah, and I believe it's about a real story that happened with a soldier who was murdered within the ranks of the service. I think he might have been in the army, and his parents went out of their way to find out what happened to him because they were being lied to about it. And the movie is called The Valley of Elah. So if you remember this now, there are the Philistines on one hill and the Israelites on another, and the Valley of Elah in the middle. So most likely this movie is saying, here's the Israelites fighting with these evil Philistines, which was the parents fighting against this branch of the service that was covering up the murder of their son. Okay? And I'm fairly certain it's a real story. And I believe Susan Sarandon is in it. Susan Sarandon, whatever. And somebody else that we know. All right, a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, which is a Philistine town, came out of the Philistine camp. So he came down from the mountain, probably into the valley, from the hill the Philistines were on. His height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, we know a cubit is 18 inches, so we're looking at about 9 feet. And I don't know what a span is, so you can add that, whatever that is. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor, meaning it was like the scales of a fish, the way it was put together, of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. That is heavy, okay? This is not the 1,100 shekels given by each man to Delilah that made her filthy rich. This is 5,000 shekels on one, let's say, 12-foot man. On his legs, he wore bronze greaves, Greaves, which I'm assuming are the coverings for the legs between the ankle and the knee. And a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point, so it was huge, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. So here comes this 12-foot person. Okay, very strong. Excuse me. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine and you are not, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me." Okay, so he is in the Valley of Elah, which would be another reason that movie would be saying it's a David and Goliath situation. They were up against the armed forces to try to find out about the death of their son. Okay. "Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we'll become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now, David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons. And we basically know this because we watched Samuel looking them over. But we didn't know that Jesse was an Ephrathite, okay? And in Saul's time, he was very old. So Jesse is very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The three oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Because remember, David is serving in the palace as a lyre player for Saul when he goes into these dark moods, or when he's tormented by a spirit, as the Bible says. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. So every day, Goliath is coming down into the valley of Elah and mocking the Israelites and saying, send a man, send a man. Okay. Now Jesse said to his son David, take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit, see how your brothers are, and bring back some assurance from them. They're with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now, the Israelites had been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He'll also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel. Boy, that right there is worth it, right? David asked the man standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? That's passion, folks. They repeated to him what they'd been saying and told him this is what will be done for the man who kills him. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? So he's mocking him, like you only tend 3 sheep is what he's intimating, okay? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. Now what have I done, said David. Can't I even speak? He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. So he's asking, tell me again what you get if you kill this guy. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Saul replied, you're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he's defied the armies of the living God. This is conviction, folks. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and to the wild animals, and the whole world will know there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. Do you know how hard he must have slung that stone to have it sink into his forehead? He must have broken his skull. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. Then the Philistines saw that their hero was dead. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Sharaim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. So the camp they left behind, they took everything they could from it. Now, David won that battle because of his deep faith, his belief. He believed it, just like Jesus said, if you believe something with the faith of a mustard seed, you can tell the mountain to go throw itself into the sea. David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistine's weapons in his own tent. As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is that young man?" Abner replied, "As surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know." The king said, "Find out whose son the young man is." As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. "Whose son are you, young man?" Saul asked him. David said, "I'm the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." Okay, one more. 1 Samuel 18. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David. And Jonathan was Saul's son, remember? And he ate the honey and it was like, "Oh, you have to be put to death because you ate the honey." And Saul was like, Saul was like, no. Or Saul thought he had to kill his son Jonathan for eating the honey after he declared a fast. And the people were like, "Don't you dare put your son to death because he just conquered the enemy out there." Okay. All right. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family, and Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. So he was a good military strategist. This pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs, and with timbrels and lyres. As they danced, they sang, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands." Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. "They've credited David with tens of thousands," he thought, "but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom?" And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had departed from Saul, and he still doesn't realize that this is the man that the Lord has anointed to take Saul's place. But he's starting to figure it out, huh? So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men, and David led the troops in their campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him, but all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. Saul said to David, "Here's my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord." For Saul said to himself, "I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that." So he's hoping David will get killed in one of these battles. But David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my family or my clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law?" So when the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of Meholah. Now, Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David, and that's not spelled like the male spelling. There's no E in it. It's just Michal. Now, Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David, and when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. "I'll give her to him," he thought, "so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." So Saul said to David, "Now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law." Then Saul ordered his attendants, "Speak to David privately and say, 'Look, the king likes you, and his attendants all love you. Now become his son-in-law.'" They repeated these words to David, but David said, "Do you think it's a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known." When Saul's servants told him what David had said, Saul replied, "Say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies." Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. When the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. So before the allotted time elapsed, David took his men with him, went out and killed 200 Philistines and brought back their foreskins. They counted out the full number to the king so that David might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter Michal in marriage. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. The Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. Okay, so tomorrow we'll pick it up with 1 Samuel 19, and we'll get back on track. I will remember that we have done 16, 17, and 18, as well as 11, okay? I love you. Keep praying. Don't forget to pray, and I will see you tomorrow. You have a wonderful evening. Love you. Good night.